Welcome to this week's class in Chassidus. We're going to be learning today a very special Chassidic discourse. The Chassidic discourse, the Rebbe said in Shabbos Parshas Viyshlach, which is also Yud Daled Kislev, the 14th day of the month of Kislev, which we know is the anniversary of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbe said this in the year Tafshin Mem Aleph, exactly 40 years ago. And the Rebbe went on to certify and edit the Chassidic discourse 7 years later in the year Tafshin Mem Ches. Now, the Chassidic discourse is based on a verse in Isaiah where the prophet says as follows: "V'chol beinayich limude Hashem," all your children are going to be scholars learning the Torah of Hashem. V'rav shalom benoich, and there'll be tremendous amount of peace, some translators happiness, for your children. So the Rebbe quotes here from his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, who said a Chassidic discourse at the Rebbe's wedding and also the Shabbos before the Rebbe's wedding, which is all printed in the Drushay Chasana of the year Tafresh Pei Tes, 92 years ago, and it's based on the same verse of Isaiah. So the previous Rebbe explains over there as follows: what does it mean, the Roy Rav Shalom Benoich? Tremendous amount of peace for your children. So, simple meaning is, he brings from the classic commentaries on Tanakh, the Metzudas David and the Targum, that say that what that means is very simple, that the one that you learn Torah, and they'll have tremendous shalom, they'll have tremendous peace. That's one simple insight he brings. He brings another insight, that through the fact that there'll be Rav Shalom Benoich, which means that through the Benoich, through the children, there'll be Rav Shalom, not for the children, but actually in the world. That there'll be a lot of peace in the world. What's the connection that through the children will be a lot of peace in the world? So he brings down the famous, from the Talmud, at the end of Tractate Brachot, where it says over there as follows: Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalim Ba'olam, that Torah scholars add tremendous amount of peace in the world. And it quotes the verse, V'chol beinayich, this verse, Limude Hashem, that all your children are going to learn Torah, V'rav shalom benoich, and he translates as follows. Benoich, the little translation, is your children. But the Talmud says, Al tikra, don't read benoich as your children, ela boinoich. So, but it's the same word. If you pronounce it differently, it could be the children or builders. So, what is the idea of builders? It means they're building the world. And he explains over there in that Chassidic discourse, why are Talmidei Chachamim called builders? What are they building? And they bring another piece of Talmud that says, why are Talmidei Chachamim called builders? My Benoyim, why are they called builders? So he said it's referring to Talmidei Chachamim Torah scholars. Why are they called builders? Because they are busy building the world up. Because the fact is, the world needs light, the world needs godliness, and when you learn Torah, you're a builder of the world, the spiritual world you're keeping alive. So based on this, it's understood that the Torah scholars are building the world. It's not just the fact that they learn Torah and the Torah itself builds the world, but it actually means that they're busy with building the world. In other words, by learning Torah and making it the business to learn Torah, it means they learn Torah, they inspire others to learn Torah, and they bring Torah, and they make an effort to bring Torah into the world. Through them learning Torah on that level, you actually create a transformation in the world. So that's the connection between the Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah scholars that are builders of the world, by not only learning Torah on its own, but actually learning Torah to bring light into the world. You are actually building and bringing tremendous strength to the whole world. So based on this, he explains the verse. What is it? So originally, the preacher explains it two translations in Rav Shalom. That what? One is referring to they will have peace, and one is they're bringing peace into the world. So based on this, he translates the verse as follows. He splits it in half. V'chol beinayich limude Hashem, v'rav shalom benoich. So there's two ideas. The first half of the verse says, V'chol beinayich limude Hashem. What does that mean? That all your children learn Torah of Hashem, And that's referring to that they themselves are learning Torah, which basically that's the first insight. What the two commentaries, Metzudas David and Targum, explains, that they're going to learn Torah, and that will give them tremendous peace in their life. But then he goes on. The verse goes on to say, "V'rav shalom b'noich," which again we said b'noich is not referring to the children; it's referring to the builders of the world. And it was through that they're learning Torah. And they're making their occupation to learn Torah, to bring Torah in the world. That will give, obviously, peace to the world. And then he finishes off in the Chassidic Discourse as follows: that through the fact they're going to be Rav Shalom B'noich, they're going to be busy building the world and bringing godliness into the world, then it'll be fulfilled in them, V'rav Shalom B'noich, which means, and he quotes the verse that says, V'rei bonim Benicha, that you'll see children, grandchildren, Shalom al Yisrael, peace in the world. In other words, through the fact that you'll be busy learning Torah and making Torah your occupation, that the whole world will be filled with Torah, you'll have peace in the whole world for the the scholars that are learning themselves and in the world, and through the fact that you'll do your work of bringing Torah into the world, in return you'll end up having the great prize, that you'll have the prize of peace. That's what the Rebbe brings from the previous Rebbe's Maamar. But the Rebbe now connects it to this week's Torah portion, a beautiful idea in this week's Torah portion according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, and explains something very, very powerful. So it says in this week's Torah portion, Parashat Vayishlach, what does it say in the beginning of Torah portion? Vayishlach Yaakov malachim lefonav. That Yaakov sends malachim, angels, in front of him. And who does he send the angels to? So the Torah tells us, El Esav Achiv, to Esav his brother. And he tells him as follows, Koi Soimrum, this is what you should tell. He tells the angels, tell Esav, Im Lavan Garti, I was living with Lavan. The Eichar ad Ata, and I was delayed until now. So what is the simple meaning of the verse? That Yaakov is excusing himself. In other words, what he's saying is, really, I should have came. He's telling the angels, really, I should have came to you a long time ago, a while ago. But unfortunately, I was delayed. In other words, he has to excuse himself for being delayed. The reason why I'm delayed because I went to Lavan. So that's a simple question. Why did Yaakov have to be by Esav? That he has to give an excuse, I'm late. He had an appointment with him, he had a meeting with him, he made up a time he was going to meet him. The Torah says, tell him I'm late. Late for what? When was he supposed to be by him? Also, that's question number one. Also, there is another question. What does he tell him? Im Lavan Garti, I live with Lavan, and Rashi says, that what does it mean I live by Lavan? And he used the term Garti. Garti, we know numerically is Taryag, 613. In other words, he was telling Esav that guess what? I live by Lavan and I kept all the 613 commandments. Now the fact is like this: we all know to Yaakov keeping the 613 commandments is important, but Esav doesn't care that Yaakov kept the 613 commandments. So why is he telling Esav that he kept the 630 commandments? What is that going to inspire him for? What's the message? What's he trying to tell him? So the Rebbe said it's known, the explanation according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, as follows: that when Yitzchok blessed Yaakov, so really Yitzchok, we know, wanted to bless Esav. Bottom line is, he didn't bless Esav, he gave it to Yaakov. Now, the fact is, if Yitzchak wanted to bless Esav, why didn't he bless Esav? Why do you have to give it to Yaakov? So it's brought down in Chassidus and explains as follows: that the truth is, the blessing is supposed to be for Esav. But if Esav would have gotten the blessings, it would have totally exploded him spiritually. So the blessings had to go to Yaakov. And Yaakov was going to process the blessings, and through Yaakov, he will be able to transfer the blessings over to Esav. So the purpose of the blessings going to Yaakov, so that he can use the blessings to transform Esav. Now, so that's why he got the blessing. So in other words, so Yitzchak gave Yaakov the blessings, but he didn't get it just for himself. He got it to be able to transform Esav. So if he got it to transform Esav, why is he leaving to Laban? He has a job to do. But the reality is, it brought down Chassidus, that in order for Yaakov to take those blessings to transform Esav, he had to first go to Laban. He had to go to the house of Lavan. It wasn't just that he went to Lavan because his brother wanted to kill him or because he was looking for a shidduch. That's according to the simple pshat. But according to Chassidus, the reason why he went to Lavan was because since he had to transform Esau and he had those blessings, he had to go through spiritually to Lavan. Why did he have to go through Lavan? So, just to finish off. So therefore he responds and he tells Esau, I'm late. Why am I late? Because the fact is, I should have been by you already. But I'm late because I had to go to Lavan. And why did I have to go to Lavan? Because in Lavan, by the house of Lavan, I had to go ahead and observe the mitzvahs, which means I had to transform whatever I had to transform in the house of Lavan. And once I finished my spiritual work by Lavan, now I'm ready to come ahead and create the transformation that we have to make between Yaakov and Esau. Now, so if that's the case, the question is, why? Why, when Yaakov got the blessings, and the purpose was to transform Esau, did he have to run to Lavan? Why didn't he go straight to Yaakov? So it's brought down in Chassidus and Kabbalah and Chassidut that in many places, and specifically, it's interesting, there are quotes over here from a maamer from Parshas Vayishlach, in the famous, one of the deepest teachings of Chassidus, in the year Taf Reish Ayin Beis in the Rebbe Rashab, and he explains two reasons why he had to go first to the house of Laban. The first reason is because in order for him, Yaakov, to do his mission with the blessings, to elevate Esau, he needed some powerful light. And guess who had that powerful light? Lavan had that powerful light. And therefore he had to go work in the house of Laban to get that powerful light. In Kabbalah it's called, Lavan means white. Lavan ha'elyon, it was a very, very high level of white, which is above hishtalshelus, which means above any calculation you can make, above nature. And Yaakov went there to go ahead and amass that powerful Lavan Elyon, that powerful light, because he needed that to go ahead and to transform Esau. So after he worked by the house of Laban, and we all know that he worked there, the Rebbe says, for 20 years. The Rebbe doesn't explain over here, but it's brought down the reason why he worked for 20 years, because we explained, I think last week, that 20 in Hebrew is esrim, and esrim, numerically, is 620. And Keser, the highest sphere we know, is the idea of 620. So he worked there for 20 years to get the Lavan Elyon, to get the level of Keser, which is above Ishtalshalos, to use that to go ahead and transform Esau. And what's interesting is, Rebbe explains very, very powerfully that what happened was, after he worked there, so what happened? It says Lavan got up in the morning, and it says he kissed his sons and his daughters. What does that mean? Because we all know that when you connect, you can say hi, you can shake hands, but then there can be a hug and it can be a kiss. Which basically, Lavan was basically connecting and giving over that powerful spark through the union of a kiss, the union of spirit to Yaakov, not only to Yaakov, but to Yaakov's offsprings, his sons and his daughters, so that they would all have the power from Lavan Elyon, from this Lavan, to go ahead and transform Esau. So again, so the first reason what the Rebbe gives here, why do you have to go to Laban, is to get this powerful Lavan Elyon to use to transform Esau. That's one reason. The second reason the Rebbe gives, why did he have to go to Laban? Because he needed first to transform Lavan before he transformed Esau. Why? Now, it's not only because his source is very higher. And as we're talking about Lavan in this world, wait, Lavan unfortunately was in the world of Klippa, which is opposite of holiness. Why? Because Lavan was higher than Esau, because Lavan is from the world of Klippat Noiga, which means it's not, God forbid, from the Klippas of the Shalosh Klippas, the three impure Klippas that you can't transform, but it's Klippas Noiga, which means it's the Klippa which is neutral. It can either be to the right or to the left. And Lavan was Klippas Noiga, and he was in the level of Keser, Chachma, and Bina, which the three highest spheroids, Keser, Chachma, and Bina. That's Lavan. Esau, we know spiritually, is the 7 midos of Klippas Noiga. So because if you look at the chart of the Sirot, Keser is the highest, then is Chachma and Bina, and then you start, if you count Keser, you don't count Das, and then you count the 7 Midah, starting with Chesed, Bur, Tferes, and that's Chod Yisoid Malchus. So because Lavan was on the level of Keser, Chachma and Bina of Klipas Noiga, Esau was already lower, he was the 7 Midas, so first he had to go to Lavan to transform Keser, Chachma and Bina, and then you can go into transforming the Midas. So again, to recap, the Rebbe explains why did Yaakov have to go to the house of Lavan before he was able to elevate Esau. One reason is because Lavan on a spiritual level was very, very high. Lavan Elyon high from Ishtalshalas. He had to go there to get that, and he got that. At the end of his job, when Lavan went ahead and kissed him and his family, they got that, and they were able to use that to transform Esau. The second reason the Rebbe gives is because since Lavan was Keser Chachma Bina of Klipas Noiga, which is higher than Esau 7 Midos of Klipas Noiga, so you have to first start the process of transforming Keser Chachma Bina before you can go into transforming the 7 Midos. Now the Rebbe is going to go into this obviously a step further. So again, so Yaakov's job is to transform. So he went to Laban, again, either to get the powerful lights or to start the process with Laban. Now he's continuing on with Esau. So Rebbe explains when it comes to transformation, elevation, there's two ways you can go about transforming. One is called Milmata Lamaila, where you deal with the bottom, you deal with the world, you deal with the roughness. And the other way is Milmaila Lamata. You come in, you shine in big light. You bring in powerful energies, and automatically everything gets transformed. So Yaakov, the Rebbe explains, his way of transformation was Milmaila Lamata. Yaakov brought in the light. And by bringing in the light, according to Kabbalah, it's called Gilui Or Elyon. By revealing the great, powerful light, that's the way Yaakov did transformation. Why? Why was Yaakov unique that was his way of doing transformation? So the Rebbe explains very simple, because we all know that Yaakov is connected to Torah. Yaakov is Torah. In other words, like this. You have the 3 Avos. Who are the 3 Avos? You have Avraham, Yitzchok, and Yaakov. The 3 represent the 3 pillars of Judaism. Torah, learning Torah, Avodah, which is prayer, and Gemilas Chasadim, which is acts of kindness. Avraham represented the idea of Gemilas Chasadim, doing charity, acts of kindness, the mitzvahs. Yitzchak represented the idea of prayer. Yaakov, on the other hand, represented Torah. 3 patriarchs, 3 powerful pillars. Now, there's the avodah of Gemilas Chasadim, which is Avraham Avinu. The avodah of Tefillah, which is Yitzchak. Those 2 are Milmata Lamaila. You do a mitzvah, you're elevating the physical world. You're praying, you're working yourself out. Torah, you're learning, you're connecting to the most powerful light. So Yaakov was Torah. So because he's Torah, the way he transformed the world, he brought in the light of Torah. And Rebbe brings here from a previous Chassidic discourse that explains the difference between the transformation that takes place through prayer and the transformation that takes place through learning Torah. When you pray, that's a transformation which is called Milmata Lamaila. What does it mean, Milmata Lamaila? That you're dealing with the item that has to be transformed. Like we discussed last week in the Kabbalah class. When you're praying, you're dealing with that animal soul. You have to deal with it. Because the animal soul doesn't want to pray, and he's bothering you. But you have to deal with it. That's the way prayer works. On the other hand, through Torah, you put on the light of Torah, there's no animal soul. The light is so powerful. Everything is gone. Now, so the Rebbe explains a step further, a step deeper. In other words, prayer, milmata l'mayla. Torah, milmayla lamata. Prayer, you have to deal with the bottom. You have to deal with what you're trying to transform. And Torah, you don't have to deal. You just bring in the light of Torah. So the Rebbe says it's not only in the way the transformation takes place, where, in other words, we have to deal with the darkness, or you don't deal with the darkness, but it also has to do with the order of the transformation. In other words, like this. When you do a transformation, which we call milmata l'mayla, which means you're dealing with the thing that has to be transformed. So that's one component. But also in the order, you go from below above. That means first you transform the lower elements, and then you transform the higher elements. And it's two separate. But the point is that you have that milmata l'mayla means both. That means like this. When you're working milmata l'mayla, you have to deal with your animal soul. That's point number one. You have to deal with it. Point number two, you have to start from the bottom and work your way up. You have to work on every single one of the emotions. Once you finish the emotions, you deal with intellect, and then you keep on going higher. On the other hand, the way the transformation milmayla lamata works is you bring in a big light. You don't have to deal with the darkness of the world. But not only do you bring in a big light, but the light actually starts on the top versus on the bottom. That means the light starts in the intellect, and then from there you go down to the emotions. So it's two separate things, but they work both. One is in the way. In other words, in milmata l'mayla, you're dealing with the thing that has to be elevated, and you have to work from the bottom and work your way up. Milmayla l'mata is you bring in a big light, and then also you start from the top and you go down to the bottom. Now, so based on this, Rebbe says, the berurim, the transformation that we do today in this world that we're living in, we do it milmata l'mayla. In other words, practically speaking, in this world that we're living in, first, we're dealing with a world, and because we're dealing with a world, first you have to transform the 7 lower spheres, which resembles the emotions, before you can start transforming the intellect. And as we know, when the Jewish people conquered the land of Israel, we were only able to take out 7 nations. When Moshiach comes, we'll be able to take out Keni, Knisi, V'Kadmoini, which represents the idea of intellect. And the Rebbe brings from the Mittler Rebbe that he says as follows, that when Yeshua conquered the land of Israel, so it wasn't just he physically conquered the land of Israel, he was able to transform the 7 emotions and the intellect which has a connection with the emotions, not the intellect by itself. So again, when Yeshua conquered the land of Israel, he started with the land. He was dealing with the land, but he also started from the bottom, the emotions, and the intellect which is connected to the emotions. The intellect itself, he did not transform. The 3 nations that he did not transform, that's when Moshiach comes, which represents the idea of intellect. However, the Rebbe says the transformation of Yaakov, and Yaakov, we said, is Torah, which comes milmayla lamata. So what was the first thing he did? He had to first go to Lavan. Lavan is Keser Chachma Bina. And then afterwards he went down to Esau, the 7 midos, which is a beautiful insight. What the Rebbe explains why he had to go first to Lavan. Why couldn't he start with Esau? Because again, since Yaakov is milmayla lamata, you have to start from the top. So he had to start with Keser Chachma, which is by Lavan, and then he was able to go to Esau, which he was, the 7 loan was the 7 emotions. Now, so the Rebbe explains and he says like as follows. Even though we know that if you have 2 ways to transform, milmata l'mayla, dealing with the thing that has to be transformed, or milmayla l'mata, just bring in a powerful light. So it's known all throughout Chassidus, which is more stronger, which is more powerful. For sure, milmayla l'mata. You bring in a light, and you don't have to deal with any darkness. Versus if you're dealing with the darkness, it's a struggle. It's a struggle, it's a challenge, you're dealing with negativity, whatever the mata is, whatever the low part is. Versus milmayla l'mata, you're living on a whole different level. So that's in general. But however, we all know, in life, there's always pros and cons to everything. So even though in generally, milmayla l'mata, bringing the light is much more powerful. But there is something which milmata l'mayla has an edge, a pro, over milmayla l'mata. What is that? Because when you bring in the light, powerful light, wow, you're busy with light, it's great, it's wonderful. But the fact is that tachtoin, the thing that has to be transformed, is not really being transformed. Because it's a light, it's totally overpowering, so the tachton, so to speak, goes to sleep. He finds a place to hide out. You haven't transformed your animal soul. The light is so big, okay, you know what, let's all sit and enjoy the light. But the animal soul hasn't been transformed, the world hasn't been transformed. However, when you do the transformation, milmata l'mayla, what happens then is, it's a struggle, and you have to deal with the challenges, you have to deal with the animal soul, and sometimes you have to deal with negativity, you have to deal with things you don't want to deal with, which is not your cup of tea, or something's even repulsive, etc. But guess what happens? After you work it out, and it's a lot of hard work, then the tachtoin, the nefesh bahamis, the animal soul, the world, becomes literally a vessel for godliness. Now, so even though Yaakov's avodah is much higher, bringing the light, and it's amazing, that's a great life to live. Bring a light of Torah, and life is good. However, there's one drawback: you're not really going to transform the physical world, because you're only bringing in a light, and as long as the light is on, life is great. The minute, God forbid, the light is not on so strong, then all of a sudden you have a lot of noise from the bottom. Versus if you spend time transforming your animal soul, when the light goes off, the animal soul's not there; it's already transformed. Now, so based on this, Rebbe explains what happened. Yaakov meets Esau, and the whole interaction, as it says in detail in this week's Torah portion. Esau runs over to him, he hugs him, he kisses him. No, so seemingly life should be great. The two of them should go together and build 2 shuls, 2 yeshivas. The two of them are like transformed. What happens? The Torah says, no. Yaakov says, okay, fine, I'm going to go slowly, and we'll meet up later. When we all know when Moshiach comes, we're going to meet up with Esau. As the verse says, V'olo Moshiach b'h'tzion lishbeth Esau, and because only when Moshiach comes will Esau be transformed. But Yaakov wasn't able to transform Esau. There was no fight, there was no war. He gave him a lot of presents, he brought in a lot of light. So he wasn't bothering him, he wasn't ready to kill him. Esau wasn't ready to kill Yaakov, but he wasn't transformed. Why wasn't he transformed? The light was huge. The light of Yaakov. He got the light from Lavan. Why wasn't he transformed? And the answer, the Rebbe says, is very, very simple. Because how did Yaakov try to transform him? By bringing in a big light. Guess what? As long as the light was on, life was good. But afterwards, Esau himself wasn't transformed. And therefore, the Rebbe says there was no true or complete transformation. Because when you have Yaakov, which is great, and you have the big light, Esau will remain Esau. In order for Esau to be transformed, you have to deal with Esau. You can't just bring in the big light. When is that going to happen? When Moshiach comes. Now, why is that going to happen when Moshiach comes? The light's going to be greater then. So why is that going to happen when Moshiach comes? And the Rebbe says, no. Because when we go in Galus, us, every one of us, we do our work. And we work on learning Torah and doing mitzvahs and praying and transforming ourselves. All throughout Galus. That means in the darkness of Galus, we work milmata l'mayla. We're doing the avodah of milmata l'mayla. Once we finish our avodah, guess what? Then Esau will be transformed. It's not just going to happen from a light. It's through our work in Galus. Now, so on one hand, you can say, 1 second, so if that's the case, what's the point of Yaakov's light? If it's really all about us doing the work, what was the point of Yaakov's light? Never said, no. Because the start of the process, that started the process that we should have, and we should have the ability, and the nesinas koyach, we should have the strength to do our avodah milmata l'mayla, comes from Yaakov started the process milmata l'mata. So as Yaakov started the process by bringing in the big light, that allows us the strength and the motivation and the ability to continue our work milmata l'mayla. So Yaakov started the process, and we continue the process. Okay. So again, what do you see here? What's the Rebbe explaining? That even though generally the avodah milmata l'mata, which Yaakov is doing, is amazing, it's powerful, but in order to really create a transformation, that Esau, our nefesh bahamis, should be transformed, that comes through milmata l'mayla. And they're both needed, because Yaakov starts the process by bringing in the big light, but then you got to continue it by doing our work. Based on this, Rebbe asks a very, very simple question, a very powerful question. We all know, the Alter brings in Tanya, the Alter says in Tanya, that Torah is nitzchis. Torah is not a book of the past. Torah is everlasting. Every story in Torah, every lesson in Torah is a lesson that's an everlasting lesson. Now, what's our avodah in this world? The light is not all on. We're living in Galus. So what are we doing? We're doing milmata l'mayla. We're dealing with the world. We each have an animal soul that we're dealing with. A personal animal soul, a global animal soul. So if that's the case, what's our avodah? Milmata l'mayla. right? We're working on transforming ourselves, transforming the world. So if that's the case, Rebbe asks a simple question: why does it in the Torah tell us, and with a tremendous detail, about the way Yaakov is sending messengers to Esau, and which basically he was sending messengers, he was sending light to him, which is all Mamayla Lamata. That's not our avodah. Why are you telling us so much about Mamayla Lamata? It's not. How is that helping us in our life? And it's not something which applies to us seemingly. Question number one. Question number two is, Rebbe says, what does the Torah tell us? That Yaakov went first to Lavan, and then he went to Esau. Now, what's the reason why he went to Lavan and then to Esau, according to Chassidus? Because by Lavan, he had to first transform, he had to go Milmayla Lamata, he had to first transform Keser Chachman Bina, and then he went to Esau to transform the 7 emotions. Hello, that's not the way we do things. We're the opposite. We're transforming, working on the emotions. Our intellect is only going to be transformed when Moshiach comes. So why is the Torah telling us how Yaakov did it? What's the point? And Rebbe explains something very, very powerful, and he says like this. Yaakov's avodah was milmayla lamata, which means he brought in the big light. And because he brought in the big light, it was an amazing light, and therefore he started off by Lavan, which represents the Keser Chachman Bina, and then he continued on to Esau with all the 7 emotions. But the fact that the Torah tells us the way Yaakov did it, so we know that Maaseh Avos Siman Labanim, anything that happened to our patriarchs and the matriarchs, is to teach us something. Not only to teach us, but it's actually to give us power and strength. And specifically for this avodah, for this way to serve Hashem. In other words, like this. Besides the fact that when Yaakov doing his avodah, milmayla lamata, in other words, bringing in the light, point number one. And then point number two is starting from the top, kesach halamin, and going down to the midos. Besides the fact that's an inspiration for us that we should do what we're supposed to do, milmata lamayla, which means deal with the world and start with the emotions and work our way up. But it's also an inspiration, and it gives us the power on the avodah of milmayla lamata, to bringing in the light and starting from the top, which is the transformation through learning Torah. How does that work? So Rebbe says, we're not talking about just regular learning Torah. We're talking specifically learning Pnimiyus HaTorah, which is a reference to Chassidus. Because transformation of learning Torah, where it's milmayla lamata, is only through Chassidus. Through learning Chassidus, and understanding Chassidus, we bring in powerful light, which creates a transformation milmayla lamata. And like the Rebbe says, let's explain in a different Chassidic discourse, part of Shalom Nafshi, at length, that the transformation that takes place through learning the revealed part of Torah, Chumash, prophets, writings, Mishnah, Talmud, commentaries, etc. We know that Torah got enclosed, in the words of Kabbalah, in Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, which has toivira, good and bad. Why does the Torah deal with all these ideas? So that we can transform the physical world, the toiv and the ra, the good and the bad that's in the world, which that is all the avodah of milmata lamayla, which means we engage in a way of war, with spiritual war, to elevate the physical world. So the avodah of nigla the Torah, the revealed part of Torah, that's the avodah milmata lamayla. You have questions, you have answers, and it's a struggle trying to understand it. That's milmata lamayla. However, learning Torah, Chassidus, which is called not Eitz Hadas, Torah, that's Nigla the Torah. Chassidus is called Ilana the Chaya, the tree of life. The tree of life is not one that we get that engages in the world, but actually, when you learn Chassidus, you're actually bringing this powerful light into the world. So what the Rebbe is saying is that we can, in this world, do the avodah of Yaakov Avinu by learning Chassidus. Because when you learn Chassidus, you're bringing in the light into the world, and therefore you start from the top. Because Chassidus is all about Ilana the Chai, the tree of life, which deals with spirituality, godliness, a whole different lens, the way to look at the world. Now, so even though generally speaking, the difference between the revealed part of Torah is that it's milmata l'mayla, dealing with the world, dealing with good and bad, kosher, non-kosher, pure, impure, and Chassidus is all about godliness, so it's milmayla l'mata, that's in general, but we know that specifically each one, Chassidus, even though it's mainly milmayla l'mata, also has a component of milmata l'mayla, and nigla, even though it's mainly milmata l'mayla, also has a component of milmayla l'mata. Why? Because we know the Torah speaks in general terms, and then you have details of the Torah. And the Rebbe explains it as follows. And he explains it based on what the Alter Rebbe, which this Shabbos actually is the big celebration of Kislev, when the Alter Rebbe was released from prison for teaching Torah and Chassidus. So the Alter writes in Tanya, and he writes as follows. And this is a very, very powerful teaching of the Alter Rebbe in Cuntas of Tanya. And he says like this: learning Chassidus, learning Pnimius Torah, learning the internal part of the Torah. And he says as follows, quote, is a mitzvah rama. It's a huge, an elevated, v'nasa. It's a very, very elevated and high mitzvah. Umevia l'leiv shalom, it brings you to a complete heart. So he says two components. That learning Chassidus, learning Pnimis HaTorah, is a mitzvah rama. It's a huge, elevated v'nasa. It's a very, very elevated mitzvah. But it also it brings you to a complete heart. What does that mean practically? Rebbe explains very simple. Chassidus has two components. By learning Chassidus. One is, we'll start from the second one, it brings you to have a complete heart. What does that mean? Very simple. We know the heart resembles emotions. Our emotions struggle. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, all these 7 emotions. Our heart, that's where all the pain and the suffering and the anguish is in. Hopefully all the joy and celebration is there. So, throughout our life, one of the main components of Chassidus is Tikkun Hamidos, to work on transforming our emotions. So Chassidus has the power, by learning Chassidus, to have a complete heart. God forbid, not a broken heart. A heart that's complete. A heart that's complete means it's transformed. Every one of the emotions are transformed. So that's one component of Chassidus. What does it mean that the complete heart? That means transforming the midas. That means that's the avodah milmata l'mayla. That's working with your attributes. Then there's another component. That learning Chassidus and knowing Chassidus is a mitzvah rama v'nasa, very, very high mitzvah, which basically means, what means a high mitzvah? It basically takes you to a place which is totally above transformation. Leiv of Shalom means you're transforming. You have to deal with it. Mitzvah Rama means a high mitzvah. You learn Chassidus, you're like, whoa, on cloud 9. You're getting to know Ein Sof, the infinite light. You're getting to the essence of Hashem. It's a powerful spiritual experience, which I'm sure you're all getting right now when you're learning Chassidus here, or anytime you learn Chassidus. There's two components. There's one where you work on yourself, and there's one where you connect to God on a very, very powerful level. So you see here clearly that when it comes to Chassidus, you have both components. You have the component where you do transformation, and you have the component where it brings in the light. So even though the main avodah of Chassidus is to bring in the light, but it also has the component of transformation. And therefore the same thing also applies to learning Nigla, the Torah, the revealed part of Torah. That they have both components. So the fact that we do transformation, we know the whole learning is about, it's kosher, it's not kosher, it's pure, it's not pure, and you're dealing with the world. But you also have the component in learning Nigla, the revealed part of Torah, where it's bringing in the light. Like for example, it says many times in the Talmud, it says, Droish v'kabel schar, learn. Not necessarily you're learning because you want to know the halacha, what to do. Is it kosher, not kosher, I could, I can't. You're learning to connect to Hashem, which is not necessarily for transformational purposes. And this idea of just connecting to Hashem through learning Nigla Torah is also in the revealed part of Torah, in Torah Shebaksav. Because when you learn Torah Shebaksav, which is the 5 books of Moses, the prophets and the writings and so on and so forth, and you're learning how to live a life, whether it's whatever maybe you're learning, so you're connecting to Hashem. On the other hand, when you're learning the halacha to know what the law is, and you're learning how to practice, that's called transformation. However, there's stories in Torah. Just stories. You read stories, not for a message or for a reason, just learning Torah. Or, for example, you're reading Torah Shebaksav. You're just reading it. You're reading Chumash, prophets, etc. And we all know that by reading, by just learning, reading, understanding what it says in Chumash, even if you don't understand what you're saying, just by reading, for example, you read Tehillim, you read the Book of Psalms. People read the Book of Psalms. People read it every single day, the whole book. Once a week, once a month, every day a little part. You're fulfilling the mitzvah of learning Torah, which is the same idea, just like learning Chassidus, which is above transformational purposes. And we know, for example, it's brought down in the Torah, the Rebbe brings that we know you have to learn a third mikra, the Chumash, a third Mishnah, a third Talmud, and the fact is that Pnimius Torah goes in the mikra. So you see that learning Chumash is in the same category as Chassidus. On the other hand, if you look in Chassidus, that even in Tanya, which we know is the Bible of mysticism, so what does it say in Tanya? That even though Tanya generally it's a godly book, so it's like connecting Milmai Lamata, but the fact is it also has to do with transformation purposes, because we know the author writes in the Hagdama, right in the beginning of Tanya, and he writes as follows. You look on the first page of Tanya, what does the author write? That he's writing the book of Tanya based on the verse in the Torah, Ki karev heilecha hadavar ma'od. It's very close to you. Beficha, in your mouth, bilvavcha, in your heart. But then he says, la asaisai, to do. And he says, to explain to you how it's very easy. In other words, the purpose and the reason for Tanya is to explain to you la asaisai, how to do it, which is transformation. So that's in detail. So you see, in the detail, in the Chassidus, you have Milmai Lamata, which bring in the light, but you also have the transformation. In Nigla, you have the transformation, but it's also about bringing in the light. But generally, that's in the detail. But generally speaking, Nigla, the Torah, the revealed part of Torah, is about transformation. And Chassidus, the tree of life, is all about bringing in the powerful light. And the transformation that takes place through when you learn Chassidus, there's a transformation. For sure it's a transformation, but it's not in a way where it gets involved with the animal soul, where you struggle with it. You just learn Chassidus, and all of a sudden, wow, you're in a good mood. You're in a holy place. You're in a godly space. You're not in the greatest mood. Take out some Chassidus, learn it. And guess what? Mood changes right away. You don't have to go to your therapist. You're totally in a holy place. You're in a godly place. It works. And guess what? You go back into that space, learn more Chassidus. There's plenty to learn. There's Tanya, there's bookshelves, and today they have in many, many languages. You can watch classes on YouTube, on other channels on the internet. There's nothing lacking. So Chassidus has the power to bring in the powerful light and put you into a great place. Now, so what is Rebbe saying here? That the transformation that Yaakov did and does was in the manner of Milmai Lamata, which means he brought in a powerful light. Also, he started from on top, Keser Chachamina by Lavan, and then he went on to Esau, the seven midos. So the same thing also Rebbe explains, that's the way it works when you learn Chassidus. That when you learn Chassidus, by understanding it, meditating on it, what happens then is, and this is so powerful, you literally transform from the top. What's on the top? The intellect. You transform the intellect of your godly soul and of your animal soul. Think about this. Wow. Learning Chassidus has the power to transform the intellect of your godly soul and your animal soul. Even and including the intellect, which is totally disconnected from the emotions. You're starting from the top. So you're starting with intellect, pure intellect, of the godly soul, the animal soul, and intellect which is not connected to the emotions. Because when you learn Nigla, the revealed part of Torah, over there you're transforming your emotions. And even the intellect that you're transforming, it's intellect which is connected to the emotions. However, when you're learning Chassidus, Pnimius HaTorah, since we brought before from the Tanya where the Alter Rebbe writes that learning Chassidus is a mitzvah, Rama, V'nasa, in its own right, is higher than the fact that it brings you to a complete heart. That's true. But the fact is it's very, very hard, very high. Because it's so high, just like Yaakov started with Keser Chacham Bina, by learning Chassidus, there's actually a transformation in the essence of your intellect. Now that's cool and that's huge. It's amazing. Can you imagine by learning Chassidus you can transform your intellect? Hello, we should be doing it all day. Transform our intellect. Now, the Rebbe asked a simple question. 1 second. Relax. The fact is, we all know that the conquering of Keni, Knizi, V'Kanmoini, which is referring to the intellect, which is higher than Midos, we said it's only when Moshiach comes. After this full transformation of the emotions and the intellect, which is connected to emotions. But how does that happen now? And the answer is yes, because that could happen through learning Chassidus. And that's why the Torah tells us about the transformation of Yaakov. Why? Because Yaakov brought in a very, very powerful light. And also he started Yaakov on the top. Keser Chacham Bina by Lavan. Later on he went to Esau to deal with the emotions. The same thing also when it comes to Chassidus. We have the power by learning Chassidus, just to bring in the light, not to have to deal with the lower part of the world, not to have to deal with the animal soul. And we start from the top, we actually transform the intellect, just like Yaakov. And which this is a very, very powerful lesson to each and every one of us. And Rebbe continues on to say as follows. What's the lesson from this type of transformation of Yaakov, which means that we do the intellect first and then the emotions, has to do with not only the way the way it works in the process, but that's also the way when it comes to learning Nigla and Chassidus. Because what did we say before? Nigla, the revealed part of Torah, works from the bottom up. Chassidus starts from the top. Now, when you start from the top, so you start bringing in the light and transforms the intellect and then the emotions. So the same thing also applies the way you study. What does that mean like this? Because even though generally speaking, what do you learn first? You learn the revealed part of the Torah. You have to learn Chumash, you have to learn the prophets, you have to learn the writings, you have to learn Mishnah, you have to learn Talmud. And then from there you go on to learning Chassidus, which teaches you the inside of Chassidus. So the normal flow is, seemingly, you learn Nigla first and then you learn Chassidus. And the Rebbe brings actually a very, very famous story from Reb Chaim Vital. Reb Chaim Vital brings, he was a student of the Arizal, and he explained the way his teacher, the Arizal, when he learned, so he learned with tremendous, tremendous effort. Up to the point when he was learning, he was actually sweating. And he actually asked him, Reb Chaim Vital said, why are you sweating so much when you're learning? And he told him, because in the revealed part of Torah, there's a lot of klipot. And in order to break the klipos, you have to toil. And when you toil, you actually break and transform the klipot. And because he was trying to break the klipot, he would sit and toil away. And obviously the Arizal was very, very smart. And he was very, very sharp. So the Rebbe says that when he learned, he would learn so in depth that he would actually come up with 7 different approaches in Jewish law. 6 different approaches in Jewish law. 1 for each day of the week. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. For 6 days of the week. He would come with a whole different, all by learning and creating a sweat to break the klipot. After he learned 6 levels in the revealed part of Torah, he would learn the Chassidus, and that resembles the idea of Shabbos. So that's generally the normal flow. But nevertheless, so even though you start with Nigla, as you see in this case, the story, that he learned the Nigla, the revealed part of Torah, 6 different ways, and then he approached the 7th way, the Connect Chassidus. But nevertheless, before he even learned Nigla, the foundations of Chassidus, the foundations of the inner part of Torah, that was natural to him. And it was not something you have to comprehend. It was a natural instinct, all the ideas of Chassidus. And that happens before you even learn Nigla. Why? Because just again, Yaakov started with from the top to the bottom, which means bringing in the light, starting from the higher to the lower. So the same thing also when it comes to learning, even though yet technically you might learn Nigla first. You might learn the revealed part of Torah first, and then Chassidus, but the foundations and the basics of mysticism has to be first. Because when the basics of Chassidus, previous Torah is there, then when you're learning the revealed part of Torah and the transformation that takes place through learning the revealed part of Torah, it's a whole different league. So as a prerequisite, before you sit down to learn Nigla, you have to learn Chassidus, which we all know, for example, before you learn the revealed part of Torah, what do? You make a blessing. What's the blessing? Acknowledging spiritually that you're learning Torah's Hashem. It's not about you, I'm going to learn Torah. This makes sense, that makes sense. You're accepting upon yourself that it's Hashem's Torah. Once you accept upon yourself it's Hashem's Torah and you have that attitude, then the whole learning is different. Now, why is that important? Why is that important? Rebbe explains very simple. Because the revealed part of Torah is limited. And the Chassidus, the concealed part of Torah, the premise of Torah, is unlimited. And when you know the approach of Chassidus, the approach of mysticism, as something which is prerequisite to before you start any engagement, then what happens is you learn Chassidus, you learn it in a way that you comprehend it, and as the Rebbe says, in a way that you're learning, as the verse says in the Torah, Ki Yarchev, Hashem is going to expand. One day Hashem is going to expand the borders. We're going to have Keni K'nizivat Kadmoini. We're going to have the intellect. But you're going to learn in a way that you already have it now, because Chassidus has the power to do that. Which, in other words, because you're going above any limits and any restrictions. And the Rebbe says, how does that work out? How do you know if you're connected to Chassidus? Which means that you're living a life of Chassidus. That's already when you go above beyond nature, above beyond time. So you're not calculated. Okay, I already learned my hour today. I already finished my class for today. No, you don't make calculations of time. You're learning. When? Always. What do you mean? What time? Why are you creating a finite experience to it? L'maylam medidim adol means there's no limits, means you don't look at the clock when you're starting and when you're finishing. You finished, you're middle. It's during your class, after your class. There's no limits. You are connected to what? To Hashem. That happens when you learn Chassidus, and Chassidus becomes real. It's not just an academic. It's not just a study. It becomes who you are. And what happens is, once you learn Chassidus on that level, so now you're plugged into the infinite. So then when you learn Nigla, then when you learn the revealed part of the Torah, you actually bring in the infinite teachings of Chassidus into the learning of the revealed part of Torah. And the revealed part of Torah, even though it's revealed and it's limited, gets the whole component of the infinite part of Chassidus embedded in it. And then what happens is, when you're doing the transformation, which takes place through the revealed part of Torah, even though you're engaging with it, it's a whole different league. A whole different league. So, based on this, Rebbe explains something very, very powerful. So, just to recap. Chassidus, learning Chassidus is Milmayla Lamata. Chassidus connects you to the infinite. It could even create a transformation of your intellect. On the other hand, Nigla comes afterwards. But even though technically you might learn Nigla first, but you have to have the prerequisite of the infinite part of Chassidus before you start. Because if you have that first, then the learning of Nigla is totally different. And then the transformation that takes place is totally different. So Rebbe asks a very simple question. What happens? So you have the outlook of Chassidus, where it's really the world is about Hashem, the infinite Hashem, and you're just one with Hashem. The light is on. The intellect got it. Then you sit down to learn Nigla. You're dealing with kosher, non-kosher, things are appropriate, not appropriate, pure, impure, etc. And you're actually elevating the world by learning it. But the elevation is coming through the fact that you pushed in beforehand the whole outlook of Chassidus. But seemingly the Rebbe says, 1 second. Here you on this high, you're bringing in this light, you don't have to deal with the world. And now I'm getting involved in learning Nigla, now I'm getting back into the world. Isn't that a downgrade? Aren't you downgrading Chassidus by bringing it to deal with the world? Seemingly it's a good question. Whoever explains no. Nevertheless, it's not true. Why? Because we know when Hashem created the world, Hashem wanted to make a dir b'tachtonim. Hashem wanted to make a dwelling place down in this world. What does that mean, a dwelling place down in this world? There should be a place, a world that's dark and God is not revealed. But in this dark place, Hashem should be revealed. Now, how could you accomplish that? By bringing in the light of Chassidus, just bringing in the light, you're not transforming the world. You have to come on to learning Nigla. You have to come on to learning the revealed part of the Torah. Because otherwise, how are you bringing light into the world? So even though it might seem, oh, why do I have to deal with the world? No, you need to deal with the world. Because you have to elevate the world and transform the world. So what happens is when you learn Chassidus first, you're on a high. And then you have to deal with the physical world. But guess what? You're transforming and elevating the world. And that's what Hashem wants. So what happens then is, then you're transforming the world. You actually elevate the Chassidus that you learned in the beginning. Higher than if you just learned it alone. So it was like this. If you just learned Chassidus, wow, the light is on. Okay, great. But then when you take that prerequisite of the way it's all about Hashem, and you get engaged in the world, and you learn the revealed part of the Torah that deals with the world, and you elevate the world, so it looks like you're downgrading because you have to deal with the world. No, but now you're elevating the bottom of the world. You're transforming the physical world. So what happens then is the Chassidus itself gets elevated to a whole different level. And based on this, Rebbe explains very, very simple the verse. The original verse that we started the Chassidic Discourse. V'chol beinayich limude Hashem. All your children are going to be learners of the Torah of Hashem. V'rav shalom b'noyich, and your children are going to have a lot of peace. So, let's translate the verse according to Chassidus that we just learned. Chol beinayich limude Hashem means that all your children are going to learn the Torah of Hashem. Which referring to what? Learning the Torah. Whether it's Nigla Torah, and more importantly, learning Chassidus. Bringing light in the world. Bringing light in the world. V'chol b'nayich limudei Hashem, they're busy bringing light into the world. Bringing light. By learning Chassidus, they're bringing light into the world. V'rav shalom b'noyich, and there'll be a lot of peace. So the literal translation is your children, but we already explained that don't say b'noyich referring to children, it's referring to b'noyich, that they're builders. Builders what? They're building the world. What does that mean? They're transforming the world. They're transforming the world through learning Torah. Which part of the Torah? The revealed part of the Torah, which comes after learning Chassidus as a prerequisite beforehand. But what happens when they learn the revealed part of the Torah and they're transforming the world, they're elevating the world? So then there comes the Torah itself that you originally learned on its own gets elevated. So again, just to recap. Chol b'nayich, when you start learning, you bring your light to the world. V'rav shalom b'nayich, then you elevate the world. Then what happens is you actually elevate the Torah that you start off to learn on its own, which is just the light. And that's why the Rebbe says, that's why in that Chassidic Discourse, the previous Rebbe explains at the end that through the fact that this b'nayich, that we're transforming the world, then we come to the level that it should be fulfilled in the children, in themselves. B'rav shalom b'nayich, they're going to have tremendous blessings of tremendous peace. So as you can see, this is a very, very powerful Chassidic discourse on many, many levels. And I think the two powerful messages, one is the whole Chassidic insight into the engagement between Yaakov and Esau. That Yaakov's job is in this world to bring light into the world. And he first went to Esau, again, either to gain the holy lights, but according to the second interpretation, which we dealt with more, to go ahead and transform Laban, Kesser Chachman Bina, and then he went to engage with Esau, the Midos. Now, unfortunately, because of L'mayla Mata, so he wasn't complete. We have to finish it Mata L'mayla. But the fact is that we have the power, by learning Chassidus, to do the avodah of L'mayla L'mata, even though generally our avodah is L'mata L'mayla, but by learning Chassidus, we can do the avodah of bringing powerful light into the world. And even not only powerful light, we have the power to elevate our intellect, transform our intellect, which really is not going to happen until Moshiach comes, but through learning Chassidus we can do it. But then we engage in learning the revealed part of the Torah, which elevates the world, which actually creates an elevation in the powerful light of just learning plain Torah. So let's hope and pray that in honor of learning Torah, and especially learning Chassidus, will be elevated on a very, very high level, and our intellects will be totally transformed, and we'll have a greater and deeper connection with Hashem. So let's hope and pray that, God willing, the next class of Chassidus will be in Yerushalayim or Kodesh with Moshiach Tzidkenu. Have a great and blessed week.